Committee will come to order. Start by asking unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be able to participate for the purpose of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. Welcome to this morning's hearing. Today we're here to learn more about the Coast Guard's 11 statutory missions, today with a focus on drug interdiction in the Western Hemisphere, what we call the transit zone. Every day, members of our Coast Guard coordinate and execute this critical mission to stem the flow of illicit drugs into the United States. Through partnerships with other federal agencies and international allies, our coasties interrupt and intercept drug cartel operations, interdicting more cocaine than all other federal agencies combined. Notwithstanding its performance, the Coast Guard remains under-resourced and is asked to do more with less, and regrettably, their work in drug interdiction is no exception. For example, the service's aged fleet of legacy cutters can only muster an interdiction rate of roughly 6% of known illegal drug movements. If the Coast Guard had a recapitalized fleet of new offshore cutters on hand, however, they could interdict 20 to 30% of known drug movement in the transit zone. So unless we're happy to sustain this inadequate interdiction rate, it remains imperative that this committee and the Congress continue to support funding increases to recapitalize Coast Guard fleets of surface and air assets. If anything, our hearing last month on the Coast Guard's budget, the budget request and acquisition activities further corroborates my belief that the Coast Guard is going to be extremely hard-pressed to maintain its existing capabilities, much less increase its operational readiness to police a transit zone that is twice the size of the continental United States. We might ask, how can we reasonably expect the Coast Guard and other federal agencies, for that matter, to accomplish their vital missions in this context? How can we demand the only military service left unpaid during the recent government shutdown to be asked once again to do more with less? If we want to succeed in our efforts to prevent illegal drugs from entering our country, we can no longer ignore the fact inadequate Coast Guard budgets have left the service with crumbling shoreside infrastructure, aged or obsolete surface and air assets, and other glaring operational needs. Till we have resolved this issue, we are far more likely to see more illicit drugs and other harmful contraband crossing our shores, not less. A truly ironic outcome that would be devastating to both the Coast Guard and to the country. Now I'd like to recognize Mr. Gibbs, the ranking member of the subcommittee, for any opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman, and I also want to thank our witnesses for being here today and for the service to our country. The United States Coast Guard carries out a broad array of law enforcement, including drug interdiction in U.S. waters and on the high seas. The service works as part of the Joint Interagency Task Force, South, to remove drugs from the transit zone. Removing drugs in the transit zone closest to the source in their purest form not only keeps those drugs off the streets and out of our schoolyards in the United States, but also makes much more efficient use of law enforcement assets. Capturing bulk shipments of cocaine in this manner takes less time and effort than following smaller packages of less pure product being moved to users. Looking at the falling targets for cocaine removal and the consistent failure to meet even those falling targets, I want to hear from the Coast Guard how the falling targets relate to the surface fleet recapitalization and the failure to implement the intended communication goals originally set out for the service's new assets. I am particularly concerned to know why, despite a decade of congressional questioning, the Coast Guard has still failed to undertake a ship life extension program for its workhorse medium endurance cutters, especially given potential further delays in the construction of the new offshore patrol cutters. In addition to Coast Guard to assets, I also look forward to learning what other agencies can contribute to and participate in the transit zone drug interdiction efforts. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to the hearing today and hearing the witness testimony. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I'd like to recognize the full committee chairman, Mr. DeFazio. Before doing so, I just want to acknowledge someone I failed to mention, that I'm honored to be accompanied today by a foster youth shadow. If you see a number of young people following members of Congress around today, it's the day when we welcome young people from the foster care system who have gone on to do extraordinary things to accompany us in our daily routine. I'm joined by Raven Prophet, here is behind me, from the great state of New York, and she's already brightened my day and reminded me of why we do this important work. Mr. Chairman, without further delay.
Great. Sounds like a great program, and hopefully it'll be an interesting day for her to shadow. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you scheduling this hearing because we need to continue to emphasize the critical role the Coast Guard is playing. I have here a poster. This is a number of Coast Guard personnel assembled in front of one of our aging helicopters. But you see in front of them an extraordinary display of intercepted drugs. Thanks, that's great. And there's a lot of talk about drug smuggling on the southern border, building a wall, and all sorts of other ineffective measures. Yet we have testimony from the former commandant of the Coast Guard before the Senate about 2 years ago that we have actionable intelligence on a large number of drug shipments coming in semi-submersibles, fast boats, being smuggled aboard fishing boats and other vessels in the extraordinary area that the Coast Guard has to observe and patrol, the Western Hemisphere transit zone, twice as big as the continent of the United States, a heck of a lot bigger, obviously, than the border. And we're only intercepting 20% of the known shipments because of a lack of assets, personnel, airborne assets, and or different, better and new cutters, medium endurance cutters, and others. So for too long, the Coast Guard has been making do. And it's time that we moved ahead with the acquisition of new assets for the Coast Guard, since they intercepted more drugs than every other agency of the federal government combined. An investment in assets for the Coast Guard, both personnel and equipment, would be a heck of a lot better than a static wall that people can go around, under, or through. Not also to mention that on the land border, most drugs are coming in through our ports of entry. According to testimony in El Chapo Guzman's trial in New York, the preferred method is to come through legal points of entry in converted semi-tractor trailers, pickup trucks, and other things. If they lose a semi-trailer or pickup truck, so what? In a multi-billion-dollar-a-year enterprise, it's the cost of doing business. So, we need to enhance our maritime interception, and the Coast Guard is the first line of defense there, and they need better assets, and I hope to highlight that today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman, and I'd like to welcome our witnesses. We're joined today by Vice Admiral Daniel B. Abel, Deputy Commandant for Operations for the United States Coast Guard, Rear Admiral Steve D. Pullen, Director of Operations for the United States Southern Command, also a Coastie, and Mr. Thomas W. Hayden, United States Interdiction Coordinator for the Office of National Drug Control Policy. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included for the record. Since we have your written statement, gentlemen, we ask you to limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. I just point out, in the case of Admiral Pullen, I'd encourage you to make any remarks in addition to the submitted testimony, since it is not yours. As much as I enjoyed reading the testimony of Admiral Craig Fowler, who's the commander of the United States Southern Command, it would be wonderful to have testimony delivered to this committee that's intended for this committee and not for another purpose. So thank you all for being here. I'd like to proceed with you, Admiral Abel. Go ahead, sir.
Well, good morning, Chairman DeFazio, Chairman Maloney, and Ranking Member Gibbs. Thank you for an opportunity to speak today about the Coast Guard's interdiction operations in our hemisphere. I'm particularly pleased to testify alongside two key shipmates in our nation's fight against transnational criminal organizations, or TCOs. In June of 1983, as a new ensign, I reported aboard Coast Guard cutter Dauntless in Miami, Florida. As such, 36 years ago, I joined the nation's fight against those seeking to traffic drugs across our shores. With this perspective, I can assure you that the tactics and resources our service employs to confront the flow of this corrosive element has evolved significantly over the last 3 decades. Concurrently and regretfully, drug runners of the 1980s have matured into transnational criminal organizations, multinational enterprises that are unfortunately adaptive, business savvy, wield the influence of seemingly unlimited funds, and are proving to be highly effective. We confront threats far from our land border, where traffickers are most vulnerable, and efforts net wholesale or Costco-styled size versus retail-size loads that could prove vexing for local police. Since success requires the convergence of three essential elements: intel queuing to focus maritime operations in the size of twice the continental United States, patrol aircraft that help pinpoint targets, and finally, an afloat presence with pursuit boats and helicopters from which use of force can be employed to compel compliance. We are getting results. Coast Guard is on track for a fourth consecutive year of 200+ metric tons of cocaine seized. These efforts likewise diminish the ability of criminals to fuel violence that destabilizes partner nations and create that migration push factor in these trafficking corridors. Regarding our on-scene presence, I cited my first assignment, Cutter Dauntless. She remains on watch today. She's over 50 years old. She and her sister medium endurance cutters are truly the patrol cars of this mission, 70% of our offshore presence. However, this fleet is increasingly expensive to keep in service, unreliable, and lacks the capability of modern patrol vessels. Last year alone, unplanned maintenance yielded the loss of 2 major cutters in the fight. Like our national security cutter, our service is grateful to Congress's efforts to recapitalize our aging multi-mission medium endurance cutters. Over 90% of 2018 interdictions were intel queued. However, it is difficult to locate targets in a massive West Hemisphere transit zone. Small unmanned aerial systems, game changers, are being added aboard our national security cutters and augmenting manned aircraft. In a single deployment, Coast Guard Cutter Stratton's small UAS was key to removing nearly 9 metric tons of cocaine and 23 suspects. Just as today's Coast Guard has matured, the TCOs have evolved in response. We now confront self-propelled semi-submersible, special-built, low-profile vessels along with the typical go-fast. But it takes a network to defeat a network. We partner with Colombia, Mexico, Costa Rica, other Central and South American and Caribbean nations. Likewise, Dutch, British, French, and Canadian ships, at times with embarked U.S. Coast Guard teams, are complementing multinational counter-drug results. Within our own department, DHS, full court press is harmonizing cross-component capabilities and getting results off Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. Now, I've cited my observations as 3 decades-plus veteran in our nation's counter-narcotics fight. One constant remains: the unwavering resolve of Coast Guard crews to take all measures, in fact, at times risking their own lives, to keep this poison from the streets of our nation and ultimately our citizens. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions, and I greatly appreciate your support of the women and men who are the United States Coast Guard. Semper Paratus.
Thank you, Admiral. Admiral Pullen.
Good morning, Chairman DeFazio, Chairman Maloney, Ranking Member Gibbs, and members of the committee. It's an honor for me to appear before you today, and I'd like to note that although I sit here wearing a Coast Guard uniform, I testify before you as the Director of Operations for the United States Southern Command, one of 6 DoD regional combatant commands responsible for all U.S. military operations in a region comprising Central and South America and the Caribbean. I note that I was privileged to follow Vice Admiral Abel in this position at Southern Command as he departed for his new responsibilities, his current responsibilities as the Deputy Commandant for Operations. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this hearing on behalf of Admiral Fowler, the Commander of United States Southern Command. Having a Coast Guardsman in this position is unique among combatant commands, and it demonstrates the vital partnership between the U.S. Southern Command and the Coast Guard, with the Coast Guard providing almost all of the maritime assets in the U.S. Southern Command region. These Coast Guard assets conduct a full suite of missions supporting United States Southern Command, ranging from counter-narcotics, detection and monitoring, national defense, humanitarian assistance, security cooperation, and training exercises. The Coast Guard also conducts critical maritime force protection for our Joint Task Force Guantanamo Bay that is responsible for the safe, legal, and humane treatment of law-aboard detainees. Simply put, the Coast Guard is U.S. Southern Command's maritime service provider. Although our partnership with the Coast Guard is most relevant to today's hearing, I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight the incredible partnerships we enjoy with other U.S. government agencies, as well as with willing and capable partner nations throughout the Western Hemisphere. These partnerships are particularly strong with respect to the detection and disruption of illegal narcotics. Nowhere are these partnerships on greater display than at Joint Interagency Task Force South, JATF South, in Key West. 20 partner nations and representatives from 16 agencies sit side by side in what has become the model for cooperation toward the common goal of stemming illicit trafficking. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you personally for taking the time to visit JATF South recently to see how firsthand we are effective in pulling together all of our strengths. I invite all members of the committee to come down and see what a great collaborative international and interagency work that JATF South is, and the great work that is being done in collaboration. I would also invite and encourage you to visit our partner nations to get an in-depth understanding of the importance of the region. I can tell you that others recognize its importance. China and Russia are here in a big way, and I say here purposely. The Western Hemisphere is our shared neighborhood. We are connected with our regional partners in every domain: land, air, sea, space, cyber, and values. The challenges that threaten our neighborhood are the same challenges that directly threaten our homeland, and the opportunities in this hemisphere are all of ours to foster and share. The Commandant of the Marine Corps said it best and most powerfully, I think. As the Chinese established presence in countries throughout this hemisphere, he noted, and I quote, "They are inside our interior lines." So how do we counter that? We have to be good partners, and that includes being good partners in the counter-drug arena. The drug trade is connected to all facets of security. It creates instability in the region, undermines the rule of law, and corrupts governments and institutions. It creates a permissive environment that allows state and non-state actors to conduct malign activities that threaten the peace and prosperity of the region. The Coast Guard regularly commits more assets to the counter-drug mission than is required through our annual force allocation effort. The Coast Guard's commitment really enables the successes that you'll hear about today. Our partner nations are also in this fight with us. Colombia has increased its eradication efforts by over 50% since last August. They prevent coca from ever reaching the transit zone, from ever starting its journey north. Partners in the transit zone like Panama, Costa Rica, and Guatemala are taking the equipment and the training the U.S. provided them and are taking cocaine off the high seas by the ton. Last year, partner nations directly contributed to 700 American lives saved. Not only is this our neighborhood, but it offers a high return on investment that directly impacts our own national security. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Admiral. Mr. Patton.
Chairman Maloney, Ranking Member Gibbs, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Coast Guard's significant role in drug interdiction in the Western Hemisphere. As the U.S. Interdiction Coordinator at ONDCP, it's my privilege and honor to work with our interdiction and law enforcement communities to reduce the availability of illicit drugs inside the United States.
Mr. Patton, excuse me, if I could just ask you to speak more directly into the microphone. The members can hear you. If you just pull it, you can pull that box right towards you if you want. That box will move too. Go ahead, sir. Excuse me for interrupting.
Got it.
Thank you.
Our Coast Guard plays a primary role in the interdiction of drugs shipped by maritime means, and it's an integral part of the layered interdiction strategy aimed at intercepting drugs at all points in the smuggling routes. 7 weeks ago, I was privileged to begin serving as the U.S. Interdiction Coordinator under the leadership of our drug czar, James Carroll. As USIC, my responsibilities include coordinating the interdiction activities of the National Drug Control Program agencies and developing the National Interdiction Command and Control Plan in coordination with the Interdiction Committee. As we develop our interdiction planning and operations, we must ensure that we're reducing the availability of all types of drugs that are smuggled from all sources. The Coast Guard's maritime interdiction mission remains a principal means of intercepting drugs and an integral part of the overall drug interdiction effort. The administration's national drug control strategy focuses on saving lives and protecting our citizens by reducing both the demand for and availability of illicit drugs. It presents clear guidance that's focused on the President's drug control priorities, which are preventing drug abuse before it starts, providing treatment that leads to long-term recovery, and reducing the availability of drugs in the United States. Availability reduction plays an important role in supporting the prevention of drug abuse and the treatment of drug addiction. Reduced availability enables public health efforts to take hold and increases the potential for successful prevention and treatment efforts. Drug availability is reduced through eradication, interdiction, and the dismantlement of criminal organizations that traffic drugs. The strategy maximizes our reduction efforts across the spectrum of drug threats. It maintains continued focus on drug interdiction at our borders, where drug cartels attempt to smuggle methamphetamine, cocaine, opioids, and other drugs every day. Strategic emphasis is maintained on Coast Guard and partner nations' efforts to interdict multi-ton quantities of cocaine that are shipped by sea from South America to our country. Following the strategy's guidance, the National Interdiction Command and Control Plan coordinates the activities of our agencies. The current plan guides our efforts across 3 broad geographic zones: beyond the border region, and within the border. The plan emphasizes information sharing between agencies to provide fused intelligence that guide our interdiction efforts. Shared information and intelligence between our law enforcement, defense, and intelligence agencies will continue to drive effective interdiction and the dismantlement of criminal organizations. Coast Guard interdictions provide actionable investigative information and evidence to support federal and state conspiracy prosecutions that more fully disrupt and dismantle these transnational criminal organizations. The Coast Guard Investigative Service is a significant partner in the joint law enforcement programs tasked with this mission. The maritime drug threat within the Western Hemisphere continues to evolve as drug traffickers travel farther out to sea to avoid Coast Guard and partner nation interdictions. Traffickers employ semi-submersible and low-profile vessels, as well as encrypted communication technologies to avoid detection. The increased use of containerized shipping to smuggle large quantities of drugs must also be addressed in our planning. Additionally, there's been an increase in the smuggling of opioids and other drugs at postal and express consignment ports, at ports of entry and domestic facilities. Given the changes in the drug interdiction environment since we last issued the plan, we're working to update it. As we update the plan, we will ensure that our state interdiction agencies have a voice in the process through the HIDA program to more effectively plan interdiction efforts inside our borders. The Maritime Interdiction Mission remains a primary element of the Beyond the Border line of effort. Coast Guard maritime interdictions in the Western Hemisphere keep multi-ton quantities of cocaine and other illicit drugs from reaching our borders. However, the United States is not the only country affected by the surge of illicit drugs, as all nations in the region face this threat. We must continue to work hand in hand with our partner nations to meet the magnitude of the threat that we collectively face. It's an honor to support the dedicated and courageous Coast Guardsmen who expertly execute the Maritime Interdiction Mission every single day. I appreciate the subcommittee's attention to the Coast Guard's critical role in the interdiction strategy, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, gentlemen. We'll now proceed to member questions. Operating under a 5-minute rule, begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Admiral Abel, Admiral Pullen, I did have an opportunity to visit with you on the JIADF Operations Center down in Key West. Very impressive, terrific international cooperation. It's amazing the missions your coasties perform and all the partnerships involving the other elements of the U.S. military. One of the things that strikes me is the fact, vast area that you have responsibility for, twice the size of the continental U.S. The Eastern Pacific is, I think, much vaster than people realize and much more important than the Caribbean in the scheme of things in terms of interdiction. I'm particularly interested in the fact that we're finally moving towards some new systems to assist you in your mission. I know in 2018, it's the first time the Coast Guard was able to contract for some unmanned aerial systems. Can you tell me how that's going? I know it's about a $117 million contract. I have the opportunity to serve on the Intelligence Committee in another capacity, and obviously, therefore, I have pretty good understanding of our country's extraordinary capabilities in intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, our ability to do persistent surveillance, to identify meaningful targets from less meaningful ones. What is the opportunity for us to be more efficient, given that we're only interdicting 6%? And can you tell me how that's going, particularly on UASs?
Yes, sir. So very proud of the fact that we've awarded the contract. Every one of our national security cutters will have embarked a contractor-owned, contractor-operated system aboard. And our experience is typically they bring 3 or 4 platforms aboard to make sure they meet the availability. We're contracting for 180 days, which is what the ship typically is underway for. Every single day she's underway, she'll have the ability of the small UAS to do that. That puts the technology risk and the tech refresh on the contractor to meet our requirements. That is seeing huge advantages. Like I mentioned on Cutter Stratton, they got 24 interdictions using the UAS. Not a substitute for manned aircraft, but it certainly can complement that. We also have a joint Customs Coast Guard MQ-9 or Predator unit in San Angelo, Texas, that is flying to the Gulf Coast, and right now she's actually deployed along the East Coast of the United States. We offer pilots and operators, CBP offers platforms and the support, and we're both seeing the advantages of using those types of systems in the war on narcotics, sir.
I want to give Admiral Pullen an opportunity as well, but I'm curious, are you tracking, is there a metric that we're following on that in terms of the efficiency per interdiction or per pound of drugs seized, or because common sense would tell you that they're going to be more efficient bang for the buck once you get that stuff fully deployed, won't it?
Yes, sir. So we're just sticking our toe into this business, and so we're going to collect just that, because the question would be the so what. Are we a better Coast Guard because of it, or are we casting more drugs? Anecdotally, we would say the answer is yes, but we'll look for data to support that, sir.
Admiral Pullen, do you want to comment on this?
Mr. Chairman, having overhead surveillance and reconnaissance aircraft is absolutely critical to the detection and monitoring mission and endgame interdiction. About 1/3 of all cases involve overhead maritime patrol aircraft. The challenge is maritime patrol aircraft have some limited duration and dwell time, and they have to return to base. There are crew risk factors and so forth. So JADF South is also looking at expanding into land-based UAS with the MQ-9s. We've got a proposal on the Hill right now looking at MQ-9s, likely having 2 MQ-9s forward-based in the AOR, and that's going to provide the persistent coverage that we need. We think that we can get those up 24 hours to provide persistent
And
coverage.
as a percentage of that transit zone, what are you going to be able to cover with those? Is it still a small percent?
Well, it will still be a small percentage, Mr. Chairman, and I will tell you, the playing field has almost doubled. So from what you saw, now we're seeing an increase, almost a 60% increase in traffic going further
Is it
south
moving
past the Galapagos.
past the Galapagos?
So what we thought was a playing field has now doubled in size. So the persistent ISR becomes even more critical.
So, because I only have less than a minute left, how about it, Mr. Patton? I read the 2019 drug control strategy, all 20 pages of it. Didn't see a lot about UAS in there. What do you think?
No, sir, it didn't get specific about UASs, but sets the broader strategy that allows for our drug control agencies like the Coast Guard to employ the means and methods that they think are most effective. UASs would be among those ways and means.
I guess the question, sir, would be whether the White House and ONDCP is going to push budget resources towards that kind of system in the Coast Guard budget. Be hard-pressed to find it if you looked in the budget that was sent up here a couple weeks ago.
Yes, sir. We support the President's budget, and we support a multi-pronged and layered effort to interdict drugs, which would include UASs in our maritime interdiction effort, which is clearly a large piece of our interdiction effort.
Thanks, sir. Mr. Gibbs.
Thank you, Chairman. All three of you in your testimony, you talk about how important it is to get this in the transit zone to interdict these drugs, and it makes a lot of sense. And I know Admiral Abels talked about a 10% interdiction rate saves 9,500 cocaine-related deaths in the United States and 67,000 drug-related offenders in U.S. prisons. And it goes on. Mr. Patton talks about maritime interdiction produces the evidence necessary to dismantle and disrupt criminal organizations that threaten our citizens. So we're all in concurrence that this is a very worthwhile project and initiative, but the budget requests don't seem to reflect that. We see, I guess questions to the Admiral is why is the Coast Guard continually not request get funding for assets to have more interdiction capabilities higher than 7.4% that's out there in non-commercial vessels. And then from Mr. Patton, the administration trying to fight this war on drugs. Why is the request essentially $1 billion less from a year ago appropriated levels? And so I'd comment, I guess, Admiral, go first, and Mr. Patton.
Yes, sir. So the Coast Guard's budget for 2020, the President's budget, does include a couple initiatives to get after this. Number one is the Offshore Patrol Cutter. Hull number 3, long lead time for hulls number 4 and 5. There is some money for the Scan Eagle. That's the small UAS that's on the national security cutters. Also, there's some innovative stuff in there. Support to interdiction and prosecution. These are three-person teams that we put in country to help that country exploit a crime scene and make sure there's a rule of law and a consequence within their own country. One more of those. We're adding more in DOMEX, which is where we exploit the electronics, the cell phones, the GPSs, the laptops, turn that around, that becomes the intel, that becomes the 90% that feeds the next interdiction case. So all of that is in there, and finally, we're also adding more intel analysts in our commands, in our intel centers to get after it as well, and 2 more fast response cutters, sir.
Just a second, Mr. Pat, I just want to follow up a little bit. In your testimony, you talked about the partnerships you have with these other countries, especially in the transit zone. The numbers we're looking at, the interdiction with that partnership, what you just said, what could we anticipate those levels of interdiction going up? You know, because we're well under 10%. Can we get up to numbers that really make some more sense, you think?
Yes, sir, ranking member. So the struggle we have, of course, is the denominator keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I mean, we are on par this year for our 4th consecutive year of 200 metric tons of cocaine. So we are catching on a par of what we've caught. We're squeezing every efficiency we can out of the existing assets that we have on scene. But the struggle we have is there's just more and more that's coming out there, and like Admiral Poulin mentioned, the area of responsibility gets bigger.
Yes, sir. To your question regarding the allocation of resources, again, we have a multi-layered interdiction plan, interdicting, outside of our borders, beyond our borders, with Coast Guard and maritime interdictions playing a primary role at our borders and inside of our borders. So we support resourcing the interdiction mission in all 3 of those locations because they're intertwined and very, very necessary. With regard to our maritime interdictions, as my colleague has said, as Admiral Abel has said, we're working to make sure that those interdictions that we're making provide the most squeeze, or the most juice for the squeeze, to lead us to prosecutions that are successful against criminal networks. Working on targeting those priority criminal networks and developing all the evidence that we can for every interdiction.
I guess to follow up, Admiral, a thought what you just said, it's exponentially growing, the amount of drugs coming. And I know we've made a lot of good work in Colombia. So where's this increased coca products all coming from then? Is it going, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Colombia. Colombia made some choices on eradication a few years ago, and we're seeing the results of that. The plants are mature, they're at their max production, and therefore it's almost predictable that you would have this amount of production coming from Colombia. Colombia is very good partners with us.
Yeah.
60% of our critical movement alerts.
But the amounts are still increasing from Colombia? Is that what I'm hearing you saying? The amount of cocaine or coca coming from Colombia is increasing? Is that what you're saying?
It is on the rise, sir. Yes, sir. We can get you some statistics for the record, sir.
Okay, that was interesting because I know we're making good work there, but apparently we're not winning there still. Okay, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Pappas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much to the panel for answering these questions and for your testimony today and for all the work that you do to keep us safe and to interdict drugs. Critically important to my state. We're experiencing the opioid crisis about as bad as anywhere else in the United States. We have a death rate that's 3 times the national average right now. I was interested in Mr. Padden's comments about opioids and the increasing trafficking by boat. I'm wondering if you could unpack that a little bit and let us know what you're observing, and if that also has to do with synthetic opioids coming from China.
Yes, sir. Great question, sir. The trafficking that we're seeing with opioids, especially the synthetics, fentanyl and so forth, it's less on the water. While there's been an incident or 2 where fentanyl's been seized as part of a maritime interdiction, it's really not coming to the United States that way. It's coming across our southern border in both powder and pill form, and it's coming through our postal and express consignment package facilities. And there's increased efforts to work in a multi-agency manner to target those entry points, particularly at the postal and parcel facilities, working with our express consignment carriers to help better target those packages coming in. That is going to be a change in focus and emphasis in the upcoming National Interdiction Plan as this threat has really evolved since the last time that the plan was issued.
As we focus on the transit zone in terms of interdiction efforts, are we missing smaller crafts that are bringing shipments of synthetic opioids directly from Mexico to the U.S.?
Sir, if I could take that one. We're not seeing increased maritime shipments of synthetic opioids from the transit zone. As Mr. Patton said, that's just not the way it's shipped. It's usually coming in as a precursor into Mexico, synthesized, and then transited or trafficked in other ways. But I think there's an important point here, sir. Cocaine has become the delivery vehicle of choice for synthetic opioids. Over 70% of cocaine overdose deaths involve fentanyl. So cocaine laced with fentanyl, cocaine used with fentanyl, et cetera. So it's not easy to just divorce the two problems. I think that the two problems are inextricably linked. So even though we're not seeing any kind of movement of opioids by sea, we've got to remain in the cocaine fight. Over.
I was recently with the captain and crew of the cutter Tahoma in Portsmouth Harbor, New Hampshire, and they were sharing some of their observations about the increasing technology of the cartels and how it's been difficult to keep pace. Could you comment a little bit about what we're seeing out there with respect to their advancing technology? You mentioned UAS and some other innovations that you hope to deploy, but how are we going to keep pace over time?
Sir, so these multinational corporations that are TCOs are going to leverage every technology they can. GPS trackers on their vessels, the drugs, encrypted comms. The good news is what they rely on can become a vulnerability. So I mentioned DOMEX, which is document media exploitation. We're getting more and more into that business, which is taking everything we can off the electronics, turning that back around, feeding that in with basically what we get from the interviews with the folks, the suspects that we've collected, and then that drives what our tactics are for the next takedown. So that we're using technology to find them, and we're using technology against them.
Sir, if I could just offer that we face a very agile adversary with these drug trafficking organizations. They will make adjustments as we make adjustments. One of the things that we're seeing is a change in tactics, moving from go fast to low profile go fast vessels, and the increased use of semi-submersibles, which are harder to detect. And it goes back to the chairman's point that we're only able to detect about a small percentage of known movement, only target about 20% of movement.
Well, thank you. I know this committee stands ready to work with you to try to get a step ahead and try to improve those numbers. So let us know how we can help. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Abel, in your comments early, you talked about three things that were necessary, and you said intel queuing, patrol aircraft, and a float presence. Do you have those divided out in the budget? How much money is allocated to each of those?
Sir, we can certainly get that for you. I know that our aircraft, the helicopters, there's an investment this year with our acquisition money to upgrade the helicopters. The patrol aircraft, both the C-27s and the C-144s, are getting sensors and increased capabilities to do that. We're also, on the operating side, we're going to go one more helicopter presence with the helicopter that shoots from the back of the back of the cutter. We've increased that as well, and we have more intel folks that are going to be adding on to that particular. So we're adding on to the intel side, document exploitation, helicopters, and then of course the offshore patrol cutter is the platform that carries them all.
Okay, if you don't mind getting me those numbers, get with my office a little later. You said that you were on, the Guard was on track to interdict 200 plus metric tons of cocaine seizures. When you do that, and you also mentioned, I think, cash, and one of you mentioned getting the sums of cash or whatever it was, where does that money go? In other words, if you interdict a drug trade and the guy's got $100,000 in cash, whatever, where does that money go?
Good. I think Mr. Patton's going to take that one.
Okay, he has it in his back pocket, does he?
Yes, sir. Whenever cash is seized, bulk currency is seized, whether it's through a maritime interdiction or at our borders or within the country, it's a law enforcement seizure, and it goes through forfeiture proceedings. If it's coming from a Department of Homeland Security agency, it'll go to the Treasury Asset Forfeiture Fund. If it comes from a Department of Justice seizure, it'll go to the Department of Justice's Asset Forfeiture Fund.
I'm aware, and I didn't get to shake your hand, Mr. Patton, I apologize. I thought we were running shorter on time. But I'm aware of at the local level, for example, I'm from Texas, when a lot of that money is seized, it can go back to the different agencies. Do we get that money back to the Coast Guard for investment in those kinds of assets? Do you know?
Sir, I'll find out the answer to that and get back.
I mean,
to
it would
some
make
of my
sense
colleagues.
to me. I mean, if we're interdicting drugs and we're getting the fruit of their efforts, however that small or large that might be, it ought to go back to the agency. So you can find out and get back to my office?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then Admiral Poulin, you said, I've been to Jadis. I went, I think it was 1 or 2 years ago with the science committee on the way down to look at some telescopes and stuff down in South America. We stopped there on Key West. We went through Colombia. And I remember seeing a map of, it looks like all the targets all around, and they were being tracked. So 2 questions. Do you know the percentages of the governments that are helping us, Colombia, and you can go right down the list. And it was quite impressive, by the way, the coordination and cooperation as we viewed it. Are they spending an inordinate amount of money or, in helping support this drug interdiction? Or are we spending the most of it? Do we know those percentages from those different countries?
Sir, we have data on that, and I'll get back to you, but let me answer the question this way. Colombia is our strongest partner in the region. I recently visited Colombia. I met with the head of the Caribbean fleet and also the Pacific fleets, and I tell you that the sailors there are fully committed to the counter-drug mission. As I mentioned in my opening statement, President Duque has increased eradication by over 50%. And I think there's another point to emphasize here. Colombia is just not all in with their treasure and their assets. They are in with their blood. Just this past year, there have been a number of deaths involved with IEDs for those that are trying to eradicate the cocaine. I think the number is 8 deaths and upwards of almost 30 injured, some of those permanently disabled because they're amputees. Not only that, Colombia is bringing the fight to the ELN, FARC dissidents, and drug trafficking organizations, and they're taking casualties, sir. So they're a strong partner, and they're all in on this counter-drug fight.
Okay, that's good to hear. And then Admiral Abel, you said also that they're starting to rely on more and more electronics, and by doing that, it's becoming a liability because we're able to take advantage of. Explain that. Elaborate on that.
Well, sir, I really can't get into too much of that in the unclassified level. Be happy to give you a brief on how we can certainly use it at sea, but then it's exploited when it's collected as evidence after the interdiction.
Do they get tracking devices on their semi-submersibles?
I'm sorry, the question again, sir?
Do they get tracking devices on their semi-submersibles when it's under, semi-submerged?
Sir, the drug trafficking organizations will use whatever technique they can to avoid detection, leverage technology. We're trying to leverage technology as well.
Okay, well, I appreciate y'all and wish you all the best, and we're glad to be somehow able to help. Thank you. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for being here today and your testimony. Let me start by just saying that I truly appreciate the work of the men and women of the United States Coast Guard and the men and women of the U.S. Southern Command and the work that you're doing on behalf of our nation. But this will be the second time in the same number of hearings with the Coast Guard where I've expressed grave concerns about the extent of what we as a nation ask you to do. I think you're spread much too thin. We heard testimony in the last hearing and before the subcommittee about your participation in freedom of navigation missions to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific. I just came from a national security conference in Singapore. I get the importance of that mission, but I question whether or not the Coast Guard should be in the Strait of Taiwan and the South China Sea when the Navy, which has a budget 200% of your budget, ought to be doing that. Earlier this year, Admiral Schultz, in his State of the Coast Guard, recognizing that you're a modestly funded organization, stated that you are approaching a tipping point, and not only because of an aging fleet, but also because of a very small operating budget. while the Coast Guard may have resources to interdict 20 to 30% of drugs flowing through the transit zone, the GAO noted that for the period in fiscal year 2009 to 2013, the Coast Guard deployed cutters used for drug interdiction for fewer days than planned, and that maritime patrol aircraft hours were below target levels. These factors likely contributed to the lower actual percentage of cocaine removed. Since fiscal year 2009, the Coast Guard has set its own internal annual performance target for cocaine removal from non-commercial vessels in the transit zone. The service has achieved its performance target only once since fiscal year 09, and for fiscal year 2018, the Coast Guard set its annual performance target for cocaine removal at 10%. This is the lowest the Coast Guard has set its annual performance target since fiscal year 2010. Several factors impact the ability of the task force to meet the drug interdiction performance targets. One of them is the inability of allied nations to consistently commit assets, and the other is the insufficient inventory of vessels and aircraft available to support operations. So my question, Admiral Abel, and whoever would like to join in the response, can you talk a little bit about the allied nations' inability to consistently commit assets? And can you speak to, and that's probably where I'd really like you to focus, because I think you've already begun to address the insufficient inventory of vessels. But tell us about our allied partners.
Yes, sir. I'll go ahead and start. We have tremendous partnerships in the region. As I mentioned in my opening statement, Interagency Task Force South has up to 20 partner nations that are participating with representatives in JADF South, helping us with detection and monitoring. We have great relationships with almost all of the countries in the region that are some way affected by illegal narcotics. I'll give you a couple of vignettes. Guatemala has made maximum use of some of the 37-foot Boston whalers that the U.S. helped them procure. They are taking those Boston whalers out 200 miles to interdict illegal narcotics, and we've seen the interdiction rates for Guatemala skyrocket. They're being very effective. Same with Costa Rica. Costa Rica just participated in a joint international operation run by JADF South. That operation, a 45-day operation, interdicted 36 metric tons. Costa Rica was involved in 10 of those metric tons.
So let me just jump in here, and I definitely appreciate the illustrations of where they're doing well, but is it accurate to say that the inability of allied nations to consistently commit assets is what is one of the contributing factors to our inability to meet performance goals for drug interdiction?
Sir, many of our partner nations have limited capacity, just as we have limited capacity to only target 20% of known movement. So there is a limited capacity throughout the region.
Okay. You know, I'm not trying to get into the, like, are they doing 2% of the GDP like we do, you know, with our NATO allies in Europe, but if our allies in the region aren't doing it, and you guys are spread way too thin, you're doing a wonderful job, but we're asking you to do a little bit too much. We need to get our allies to step up a little bit more.
Yes, sir, and maybe the best way to answer the question is that JADF South is sourced at about 29% of their ship requirements and about 21% of their aviation requirements. We need more ships and we need more planes. Those can be U.S. ships, U.S. planes, partner nation planes, and partner nation ships.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Mrs. Miller.
Thank you, Chairman Maloney and Ranking Member Gibbs. And I want to thank you all on the panel for being here today. And I also want to thank you sincerely for the hard work you do to protect all of us from this terrible thing that's happening. Like many communities in the country, my district has been ravaged by illegal drugs from the foreign countries. While the panel is focused more on cocaine smuggling, I worry about the opioids and fentanyl that I feel may soon be entering the country in a very similar manner. As President Trump and many of us here in Congress work to secure the southern border and improve detection technology at the ports of entry, opioid smugglers may turn to tactics used by the cartels to traffic these dangerous drugs in our communities. So my question's very similar to ones that have been asked before. Currently, the main illegal drug seized by the Coast Guard is cocaine, In my district in southern West Virginia, which is ground zero of the opioid epidemic, as the president fights to secure the southern border and stop the flow of dangerous drugs, is it possible that smugglers of opioids and fentanyl will turn to those tactics used by cocaine smugglers to transport opioids through the transit zone to the United States? And is there anything that Congress can do to help? Any one of you?
I'll start, ma'am. Great question. As I think we said previously, and as you note, we're not currently seeing it come by the water, but it certainly is a means that could be employed. I think currently what we're seeing, and I would defer to my colleagues, my shipmates up here on the panel, more specifically about the Coast Guard efforts in the Pacific side of Indo-PACOM. But I think we're seeing precursor chemical movements by sea coming from China and the Western Pacific region to places like Mexico where fentanyl is being produced. However, the smuggling route of finished fentanyl coming to the United States is currently dominantly the U.S.-Mexico border. So our efforts to interdict finished fentanyl are properly placed along the southern border, and we're increasing our efforts at postal and parcel facilities because we're seeing direct shipments from China coming through by those means. I think we do need to keep in mind the potential for the sea lanes to be used to move finished fentanyl. We're just not seeing it right now.
And we do have a Joint Task Force West, that's out in Hawaii, that looks at precursor chemicals coming from Asia. So that pretty much is their focus. But as Mr. Patton said, these smuggling networks, they'll seek a profit. And if there's a profit in it and they get into this business, then they may be in the business. But we're not seeing it right now.
Yes, ma'am. I obviously agree with Mr. Patton and Vice Admiral Abel. These drug trafficking organizations will take advantage of any opportunity that they can, and they will take advantage of the permissive environments that exist. So we're watching this very closely. Joint Interagency Task Force South has a great relationship with Joint Interagency Task Force West, which Vice Admiral Abel mentioned. So we're in close collaboration, watching trends. We're watching the problem set very, very closely, ma'am.
Vice Admiral Abel, I want to thank the brave men and women of the Coast Guard for their tireless efforts to stop the flow of the dangerous drugs in our country. What are the biggest hurdles that the Coast Guard faces in meeting the performance targets for cocaine removal in the close future?
Well, probably both. We're looking at readiness and recap, which is both of what we need right now. Our aging fleet that I mentioned, the fact that Cutter Dauntless is my age, and I know what my age is, and I'm in my 50s, and so is she. We need to get on. Those are the patrol cars of this fight. Also, the Coast Guard on the readiness side is on the operating expenses. As a branch of the armed forces, we have not benefited from some of the rise in operating budget that we would hope. Our fellow services have seen about a 12%, and the Coast Guard's been about 4%. We appreciate the recent hurricane supplemental that was passed last year's budget. We understand there's a supplemental that may get passed soon. We appreciate the House and the Senate working on that as well. And I would say the last thing that we need to struggle, that we're struggling with candidly, is we are still restocking and we are still getting dry docks and port side availabilities and parts that we need from a 35-day lapse of appropriation. We took a major hit. Our goal is to be hurricane ready this summer based on the impact of that lapse of appropriation.
Thank you so much.
Thank the gentlewoman. Before I proceed to Mr. Garamendi, I just want to point out for the record, my colleague from Maryland, Mr. Brown, mentioned that the Coast Guard budget, that the Navy budget is 200% of the Coast Guard budget. I think he meant that it's 20 times the Coast Guard budget, north of $200 billion when you factor in OCO funding, a base budget of about $170 billion, I believe in the Navy. Yours is about 11 requested billion, so I'm sure you'd appreciate having half the Navy's budget and answer a bunch of our questions. But excuse me, Mr. Lowenthal has returned. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's good to be back. Admiral Abel, Thank you for your testimony and also for the Coast Guard's continued efforts, as we've heard here today, to combat drug trafficking and criminal activity on the high seas. And I'm pleased that in March, Admiral Schultz announced that the first 2 offshore patrol cutters will be home ported at base Los Angeles, Long Beach, which is immediately adjacent to my district. And I thank you for that. And I know these cutters will provide the capability that the Coast Guard needs to continue this important mission. What you've mentioned today, and also in your testimony, you highlight the importance of partnerships with especially with our Central American neighbors to carry out the Coast Guard's drug interdiction mission. As you know, 2/3 of the interdictions in fiscal year 2018 were facilitated by an agreement with our international partners. So I have a question with 2 parts. First part is, what can Congress do to support the Coast Guard's efforts to strengthen these relationships that you have with our partner countries? And I'm also concerned about our foreign aid to the Northern Triangle countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. Has the President's plan to suspend payments to these countries affected the Coast Guard's ability to build partnerships? So the first one is, what can we do? And has the potential shutting off of aid to these foreign aid to these countries, how will that affect your partnerships?
Sir, let me maybe start responding to that question.
Which part?
The issue of partnerships, sir.
They're all both partnerships. One is what we can do to strengthen them, and the other one is, have we seen now with cutting off of foreign aid going to affect them?
So with respect to what Congress can do, as I mentioned in my opening statement, sir, I think it's important for members to get down and meet with our partner nations, see what they're doing, get an appreciation, a more in-depth appreciation for how committed our partner nations are. With respect to the second question, sir, about our partnerships with Central American nations.
And the cutting off of aid, foreign aid.
Sir, what I can say is that we maintain strong military-to-military relationships with our South American and Central American partners. I mentioned some of the successes with Costa Rica, the successes with Guatemala. We have a forward operating base in Sotocano in Honduras that's critical for us to do all of our missions in the SOUTHCOM AOR, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, attacking transnational organized crime. We've got a cooperative security location in Comalapa, El Salvador. So our partnerships with the militaries in the region are very, very strong, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to ask now Admiral Abel, can you tell me how our foreign aid, cutting off of our foreign aid, potentially could impact these partnerships? And what should we do here in Congress?
Well, sir, as far as what Congress can do to help these partnerships, the first part of your question, step one would be presence matters in these countries, which means the Coast Guard needs the aircraft, the small boats, the larger ships to do that. Also, the fact that as we recap, we're finding with Costa Rica, excess defense articles, which is a nice way of saying our retired cutters, become a major force multiplier for these countries. So as we recap, we can hand down these assets and the support with that as well, sir. So Steve mentioned the mill-to-mill relationship we have with these countries. That is still very tight, and we still see a unity of effort.
I just have 1 minute left, so I want you to follow. Have you noticed anything with the President saying that we're going to cut off foreign aid to the Northern Triangle countries? Has that impacted our relationships? And that's to Admiral Abel.
Sir, I don't work with these countries on a daily basis. I do not know of any change in our relationship with them. Admiral Poulin certainly is a lot closer with them.
Well, I'd like to follow that in the future. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Ellerson, do you have any questions? Or are we proceeding to Mr. Garamendi?
I will pass. I've got a markup at 11, so I'll pass and follow up with QFRs.
Thank the gentleman. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Larson, thank you very much. I owe you one, and I know you'll collect.
An additional one. I want to get at this issues that was just raised by Mr. Lowenthal. There's a very serious question of priorities. In fact, Mr. Lowenthal, we do make choices here. And we make those choices in conjunction with the president. The president intends to spend some $8 billion building a wall. And the question really revolves how best to spend our taxpayer resources. Is it best to spend it on a wall? So therefore, the question of cocaine into the United States, does it come via the ocean, the water, or does it come via the land? And if it comes via the land, how does it get here? This is a question for Mr. Patton.
Yes, sir, thank you. Cocaine is flowing to our country both on the water and across our borders, so it's not exclusively in one of the
When it comes across the borders, does it come through the ports of entry, or does it come through a trail across a desert?
It comes predominantly through the ports of entry, but it does come from all points across the border.
What does
These organizations
predominantly, what does predominantly mean? Is that 70, 80, 190%?
I'm sorry, sir, could you repeat the
You
question?
use the word predominantly through the ports of entry. Put a percentage to that.
I'll need to get back to you with a more accurate percentage, but it is the
Take a
dominant.
shot. You use predominantly, I suppose that's more than 50%.
All right, yep. More dominantly, I would say over 80% is coming through the ports of entry.
So if we're going to deal with drugs entering the United States through the land, then it's really the ports of entry that we need to spend the money on. Is that correct?
Sir, as I've testified before.
Let me just say, my view is that is correct. If it's 80% of the drugs are coming through the port of entry, spend your money, spend 80% there, not 100% or 80% on the walls. Secondly,
Sir.
with regard to the oceans, it was said that some 20%, the Coast Guard is able to interdict some 20%. It was 19, 17, 20% in that range. Let's just say 20%. Is that okay? About right?
So right now, we intercept and action 20% of the known drug flow that we know about.
Okay, then there's more that you don't know about, but okay, let's just say 20%. So that means you're doing some 200, so we have some 800 to 1,000 metric tons of cocaine coming into the United States through the oceans. Is that correct?
Sir, every day, Giant South has to make trade-off decisions. They have 5 or 6 vessels that they can action, and they've probably got 20 to 25 known targets with intel that they're moving in the transit zone.
So once again, this is about choices, and we make those choices as well as the president. The president has chosen to spend some $8 billion on border walls, some smaller amount on enhancing the ports of entry, and yet we have some 800 tons, metric tons of cocaine that is not interdicted, that enters over the water. I think that's about the way the percentages work out. So if you're interdicting 200 and that's 20%, then we ought to multiply by 5, which would give us something near 1,000 metric tons. Correct?
Well, sir, I
Well,
want to be
just-
careful on the statistics because about 60% of movement out of the Andean Ridge lands first in Mexico or Guatemala. So there aren't direct shipments per se to the United States. There are some, but most of it first lands in either Mexico or Central America.
And then you interdict both after it leaves Guatemala as well as when it gets to Guatemala. You interdict both sides of it. So the point is still, there's about 800 tons of cocaine that you don't interdict. And we've already heard testimony that your budget is insufficient. It's just a matter of choices. What I'm making here is an argument that we are spending the money in the wrong place.
Yes, sir.
wanna go
To
out-
be clear on the statistics, we can only target 20% of known movement. The interdiction is 6%.
Well, that makes my numbers even more. In any case, it's a question of choices. And what is going on here is the U.S. government is making the wrong choice. It's spending the money in the wrong place. If it is about drugs, then we've got to spend the money with the Coast Guard, and we've got to spend the money helping those countries, Guatemala, Colombia, and the Central American countries, beef up their own police, which you've made the argument already. My time is up. Thank you very much, and I appreciate Mr. Larson's.
Thank the gentleman. We have time for the second round of questioning, so proceed to that round. 5 minutes each. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Gentlemen, just following up on that point, how many Coast Guard personnel are currently deployed to the southern border as part of recent border security operations?
Yes, sir. As of this morning, we had 155 Coast Guard members that are down there. Medical team, general purpose, helping on the border. We have a helicopter that is occasionally flying from Corpus Christi and some small boats that are running up and down the Rio Grande, sir.
And what would that typically be? What does that represent in terms of what would normally be deployed? Is anything normally deployed from the Coast Guard to that
No, sir.
mission?
This is unique, but
So that is a new mission for the Coast Guard.
this is why there is a Department of Homeland Security. We are helping our shipmates in CBP and Border Patrol, just as their P3s helped us in the hurricane last fall and last summer. We're helping them out. Out of a force of 42,000 active, 8,000 civilian, and 6,600 reserves, I think 155 is a reasonable number, sir, and we're not seeing a huge impact on our operations.
I understand. What would those personnel normally be doing?
Sir, the helicopter crews are deploying out of Corpus Christi. That's their home. The boat crews are from maritime safety and security teams from all around the nation. They're bringing boats and bringing their capacity down there. As far as the general purpose that are helping in the actual processing centers, those are volunteers from around the Coast Guard.
And let me ask you a different version of Mr. Garamendi's question, because I don't want to put you on the hook for making policy decisions that aren't yours to make, or that you're simply in the position of having to implement, and quite properly so. That's your job. But if I gave you $1 billion in addition to the $11 billion you've requested, what would we do with that $1 billion?
Sir, it would have to be a mix of operations and recap, because both of those are what we're struggling with right now. The day-to-day maintenance of aging assets, getting what we need for our workforce, as well as buying the future of the Coast Guard. So it would be recap as well as operations.
And if I gave you $1 billion simply for drug interdiction efforts specifically, so forget the polar cutter and the other things that we all care about up here as well, but if we were just talking about drug interdiction, if we were talking about border security more broadly, what would the Coast Guard do with $1 billion?
Sir, I mentioned the offshore patrol cutters. We have got to get after that. That is those medium endurance cutters, 70% of the presence. They are aging, they're expensive, we're losing operational days on those. We have to get after that. Aircraft, I mentioned the triangle, intel, aircraft, patrol aircraft, and then the helicopters on the back of the cutter, as well as the small boats on the back of the cutter. All of those need investment.
Well, your entire drone program is $117 million, isn't that correct? The entire drone program, the UAS we were speaking about earlier, it's $117 million at this point, right?
Yes, sir. That's a multi-year contract, though. That's not just this year, but it's an investment in the future. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Great point. So how many years is that over?
I can get back with you. I believe it's a 7-year contract, but I can get back with you on the terms of the contract. I'm not the
Fantastic. So
acquisition.
we could increase our unmanned aerial capability by an order of magnitude with several $100 million, let alone $1 billion. Fair to say, right?
We would need the afloat platforms that they operate from, though. The smaller cutters don't have the room to have a UAS and a helicopter, and certainly the armed helicopter is part of the takedown.
I understand the complexity, Admiral. I'm talking about $1 billion. We could have contractor-owned and operated systems that don't even involve Coast Guard ships, right? We could have a series of platforms out there, or barges, or contractor-operated vessels that were operating drones that were just feeding intelligence to the Coast Guard Operations Center in JIADF, right? I mean, you'd be happy to have the data, right? And if we were better at distinguishing it, we could increase the number that Admiral Poland's talking about if we also had the assets to go get them. Isn't that fair to say?
Yes, sir. And as I mentioned, we already have experience with the MQ-9 with the joint unit that we have with Customs.
In fact, one of the great capabilities you have are those kids who run those boats out and shoot the motors out of those drug vessels. I got to meet some of them. But when you think about it, there's no reason we couldn't do that with an unmanned platform in the future. Isn't that correct? With the right eyes-on human operator, but remotely operating an armed drone, we could do that too, couldn't we?
Sir, I really don't want to speculate about use of force. It took a lot to get Department of Justice approval for the armed aircraft that we have and the accuracy of our marksmen, and to make sure that there's no collateral damage when we do employ use of force.
Yeah, that's right. But a kid in the back of a boat with a gun shooting out a motor is not a lot different than a kid with a joystick operating a gun on a drone. Just for the record, because they're both highly trained and highly capable and follow extraordinarily rigid procedures around use of lethal force. So, Mr. Patton, just put in a plea for the fact that the point Mr. Garamendi, I believe, was trying to make is that these dollars we're throwing at border wall construction that are coming out of other military priorities are desperately needed in the drug war that is being fought right now by the gentleman to your left. But I see my time has expired. Mr. Gibbs.
Thank you. One thing I'd say, I've heard a lot about how you're increasing your capabilities to gather intelligence and everything. That's good, but the problem is if you don't have the assets to go out and interdict when you get the intelligence, it's kind of counterproductive. The offshore patrol cutters, there was in the 2019 budget hearing, started for recapitalization, awarded a contract for the OPC, and they're supposed to report last Friday because we had the hurricane go through there, and the surrounding area was being built. And the report was supposed to talk about the delays and the cost overruns. Did the report submitted? Is it finalized?
Yes, sir. I'm not the acquisition expert here, but as the operator, I can tell you we do need the OPC. The material was submitted from Eastern Shipbuilding. It's being reviewed by the United States Coast Guard, and we will make the decision that's in the best interest of the United States government based on the material we've received.
Will that report be submitted to the committee? The report that was supposed to be due last Friday?
Sir, it was some contract-sensitive material. We certainly can consider such.
Okay. I'm trying to get through this, but we had the high endurance cutters, mostly at the end of their useful life, right? And then the OPCs were going to replace them, if I got that right. And then medium endurance cutters. And then we have the question about maintenance on them to extend their life of them while we wait on these other vessels. I guess my question is on the medium cutters, close that gap that the OPCs are built. What are we doing to help close that gap, and how many days conducting those missions are currently lost each year, the unavailability of the Coast Guard assets plan and mission days?
Yes, sir. As I mentioned, last year we lost 300 cutter days. That's equivalent to 2 cutters. The 24 vessels that constitute the medium endurance cutter fleet, the 210-foot cutters circa 1960s, we don't see a need to recap or do any service life extension on them. The 270s, which are circa 1980s, we do have a plan to do a service life extension program. In fact, in our 2020 budget, it's about $11 million to start that program. The goal is the first one of those hulls will go into that program in 2023. We're dovetailing it closely with when the OPC should be showing up, so we don't see too much of a dip in capacity. And we anticipate the Coast Guard Yard in Curtis Bay will do the work and a key on major systems of the 270s that need to have a recap. That's our plan at this point, sir.
Okay, because I'm just trying to drive it home the fact that we need to get more assets out there. So we got to have, I think one of the criticisms can be made at the Coast Guard is the long-term planning issue. There hasn't been any long-term planning where it really should be. Is there any capability of, from contracting or leasing vessels from the private sector, like, for example, the oil and gas industry, if there's a little bit of a downturn there, to help, help the Coast Guard get more assets out there with Coast Guard crews to get the vessels to kind of fill a void? Is there that in consideration of that? Is that a possibility?
Sir, we certainly can take a look at that. There are some issues of being a warship, a law enforcement vessel from which you do use of force and things like that. I know our friends in JIDF South do have a leased vessel that is doing logistics to enable the Coast Guard cutters to remain on station and remain more effective.
Hey, sir, if I could just add to that, the naval combatants are absolutely essential to the detection and monitoring and endgame mission. I mentioned before that we need more ships and aircraft. Yeah. We need more Navy ships, and we need more Coast Guard ships. We're very pleased that we will likely get a littoral combat ship working for the Southcom, in the Southcom AOR this year. I was just up in Mayport. I got a chance to tour the littoral combat ship with Admiral Fowler. I think that's going to be an incredible capability. Still not enough, but again, we're looking for ways to shore up those gaps that we have in maritime assets. Over.
Okay. I guess one quick question. We talked about the communication systems, the Deepwater Legacy. What's the status of that? You know, there was talk previously in previous hearings about that, and I didn't know if it's really been implemented or what's the status.
You're saying as far as communication systems to and from our cutters?
To improve, yeah, the whole integrated system.
Yes, sir. Obviously, like any modern organization, you know, IT is your spinal cord, and if you can't connect, you can't play.
Yeah, that's right.
This budget, our 2020 budget, is the first time the Coast Guard has put dedicated acquisition money in there to recap our mission enterprise, which is how we connect, how the system works, the backroom stuff. We're looking at using the cloud, all these various ways of doing it, but we're going from just repairing the existing software and hardware we have to recapping and looking the next generation forward to make sure that spinal cord is well connected amongst our assets.
Which I think would be really essential in the interdiction efforts, correct? I yield back. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Lowenthal.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I think we've done an excellent job, the panel, in terms of talking about the needs of the Coast Guard, unmet needs, what the budget will entail. Also, in the importance, I think, Admiral Poulin and also Admiral Abel talking about the importance of relationships with our Central American neighbors. And I think we've adequately covered that, but I'm going to switch the topic a little bit because I think, Admiral Poulin, you mentioned in your testimony the expanding influence of Russia and China in our hemisphere, and we really haven't talked that much. And I'm particularly concerned as one who represents the port area of Long Beach and China's investments in ports and maritime infrastructure, especially around the Panama Canal. Can you tell us what you're doing to combat this, what Southcom is doing to promote transparency, and how you're dealing with this growing presence of both Russia and especially China in our region? Explain that to us.
Thank you for the question, sir. We are very concerned with the growing influence of both China and Russia in the Southcom area of responsibility, the Western Hemisphere. Yes. I did bring with me 2 placemats that capture what we see as the growth and influence, and I'm happy to share these with the committee, and I will leave these behind. But what we're seeing is an increased intent to sort of crowd out the United States as a partner of choice in this region. If you look at China alone, to your point about port investments, they've invested in about 60 port projects in the region. That's significant.
How many projects have we supported?
What I can tell you is 60 port projects is a lot, and they're on both sides of the Panama Canal, sir.
Got it.
So it's a great concern to us. The amount of investment that they're doing in infrastructure, the IT investment from Huawei and ZTE, which creates complications for us because that is now becoming a backbone of the IT infrastructure for many of our partner nations, compromises our ability to get in there and work with them about security concerns. Russia's malign influence is growing as well. They are mounting a huge disinformation campaign, changing the narrative about the goodwill and the good work that the United States is doing. China is supporting the Venezuelan regime. They are the largest creditor of Venezuela, $20 billion in loans and about $1 billion in providing military equipment. Russia and Cuba are malign actors as well that are propping up the illegitimate Maduro regime. So those are just some small examples of how concerned we are about their influence. What we can do about it, sir, is we become good partners. Presence matters. Presence matters a whole lot. We need to continue to do international military education and training to make enduring partnerships in the region. We need to continue to be present with assets. We need to continue to be present with our special operations forces doing training. Military-to-military engagement and persistent presence is absolutely essential to making sure that we retain our status as a partner of choice and limit opportunities for malign influence by Russia and China.
Again, I'm going to ask Admiral Abel. I say again that, as I said before, the cutting off of foreign aid at a time when we are watching our enemies investing tremendously in this region is very frightening to me. Admiral Abel, do you have anything else
Just
to add?
to add on to what Admiral Poulin mentioned, the Coast Guard offers a very good model for these partner countries. If we have some excess defense articles that we can transfer to them, we can teach them on the maintenance. And if they model their Coast Guards or their navies like the United States Coast Guard, that's a good fit. The United States Navy with large ships is pretty intimidating, and it's not a model that fits well with many of these Central and South American countries. So the nation building that our Coast Guard can do is just that. A force that's a little law enforcement, a little search and rescue, a little marine environmental protection, and the goal would be let's model that kind of a service for these countries, a maritime protection service.
But you're also seeing the rise of China and Russia in the region. Is that not true?
Absolutely, sir. I think Admiral Poulin characterized it well, which is checkbook diplomacy as well as trying to squeeze out the United States. We need to be the partner of choice in this hemisphere.
Yes, sir, and if I could just add, the predatory lending practices of China are profound. About 19 of 33 countries in the region have joined their Belt and Road Initiative. That's a huge concern of ours.
Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Are there any further questions from members of the subcommittee? Seeing none, I'd like to thank the witnesses for their testimony. I'd like to ask unanimous consent that the two placemats provided by Admiral Poulin be made part of the record of today's hearing without objection, so ordered. I'd also point out to the members of the subcommittee and to others that the subcommittee will be holding a hearing on China and the One Belt, One Road initiative, particularly in the region and the relevance for the issues of concern to this committee, which are many, but I appreciate the gentleman's comments very much. I would also ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may have been submitted to them in writing, and further unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members of or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. If no other members have anything to add, I'd like to thank the witnesses again for their service, for their extraordinary contributions to our country, to our nation's security, to the war on drugs. I appreciate the participation of Mr. Patton as well of ONDCP. And with that, the hearing stands adjourned. Thank you.